Jewish side were working on astronomical tables. The quadrant, for instance, was developed by a very famous, was further developed by a very famous Jewish philosopher in Muslim Spain called Ibn Ezra. You had the quadrant being worked on. You had this astrolabe, which made long sea voyages possible, being developed until it reached its zenith of development under a Jewish philosopher writer in Barcelona and in Majorca called, what was his name now? Zacuto, Abraham Zacuto. And he is someone who both Columbus and Vasco da Gama consulted. So these people were inventing and perfecting scientific instruments that were later being used in the voyages. So Abraham Zacuto is probably the most famous name, but there's a whole series of these people in the 1300s and 1400s. Another individual called Levi ben Gersonides, who was involved in the development of the astrolabe and also involved in working on astronomical charts. So they also perfected the astronomical charts that helped the voyagers in the long ocean voyages that they were going to embark on, because without the astronomical charts, which gave you the phases of the planets and the stars and the constellations and so on, and tied it to the date and the time of the year, etc., and then you would work with your quadrant and your astrolabe and these different instruments to pinpoint where you were. All of these long voyages were impossible. So you see how the cultural development moved on into these tremendous, rich developments of the kind we are talking about. It's an interesting episode that's told about some of these charts, Abraham Zacuto's charts, which in fact Columbus was using, that they were so precise. Now I don't know whether this is apocrypha or whether this is actually real, but they were so useful and so precise that at one point when Columbus was on one of his voyages and he was in some physical danger, he was able to frighten the local inhabitants by predicting a lunar eclipse of some kind. This sounds a bit apocryphal, but he supposedly was able to, on the basis of his charts, the very charts that these philosophers and thinkers were developing, he was able to predict an eclipse of some kind, and therefore threaten the local inhabitants that if they didn't stand down, there may be a further eclipse of the sun next time. So he was able to save himself by the usage of some of these charts. So as I said, on the Jewish side, you were getting this very great cultural development. This cultural development moved into and developed from the translation from Arabic through Hebrew into Latin, and then the scientific knowledge that moved from Arabic either directly into Latin in some cases, but usually through Hebrew into Latin, was the kind of knowledge that fertilized the beginning of the Renaissance and the beginning of a new outlook in the West, where people were thinking in this way. I think what I would like to do is try to trace the end of the Islamic presence in Spain and the final expulsion of the Jews and the Arabs, which was a very sad episode, as you probably know. With the final conquests, Ferdinand and Isabella had unified the whole of Spain. I think by the 1200s, most of Spain had fallen, except for the southern section, Granada. And have any of you seen pictures of this city? It's a fabulous city with fountains and marvelous architecture and so on. Most of it had fallen except Granada, and then with the fall of Granada in 1492, the fate of the Jews and the Arabs was sealed. Now you might want to ask the question, why were the Jews and the Arabs expelled from Spain, or the Muslims? Well, I'm not sure how many Muslims actually were expelled from Spain. It looks like quite a number converted to Christianity, and that is a long study in Christian-Arab origins in the cultural study of Spain. But quite a few Jews we have the records of did leave Spain. I think, you know, in the hundreds of thousands perhaps. Quite a few probably were also converted. Again, if you ask the question, why was this? In my mind, it's very simple. It's just the old Visigothic intolerance reasserted itself once the Reconquista was completed. I don't know if that's a sufficient explanation for you, but you have to realize that the Jews and the Muslims were both being expelled. What the numbers really were isn't clear. And the strange thing about the run-up to Columbus's voyages is that the actual date of Columbus' departure, and I don't know what the resonance of this might be, was the actual date, the scheduled departure of Columbus, was the actual last day for particularly the Jews. I'm not sure if the same date was for the Muslims. Particularly the Jews was the last date for them to leave Spain. Now you can say, well, how did this happen? I mean, you didn't just leave overnight. But I think they had a 3-month waiting period. But the date of Columbus's departure was the end of that 3-month, preparation waiting period. And Columbus is said to have noted in his diaries some of these ships in the harbor here leaving. Now, there were also Jewish people who seemed to be involved to a certain extent in Columbus's voyages, as you may know, and some of the people who were behind the financing in the Spanish court were of Marrano background. Marrano, do you know what that means, Marrano? Marrano were people who were converted to Christianity, but had not yet completed that conversion in their souls and were keeping the Jewish practices in a private way. So you had some Marrano people who were cooperating and backing these voyages with their financing. And many people have said, was Columbus himself, or suggested, was he himself a secret Jew, or what was he of a Jewish background? This is something that has been debated, and I am not able to add further light to the subject. I can only say that it has been suggested. Some have accepted it, some have rejected it. His origins in